Okay, so here we're going to review or introduce the concept of crowding out. Crowding out is another one of the favorite ways that the AP exam likes to test your ability to look at both the short run and long run consequences of the policy decisions that governments make. Crowding out in particular is most interested or most involved with fiscal policy, and we use our loanable funds model to demonstrate some of the consequences that fiscal policy can have on spending by other entities and on the economy at large. Really, the question here is that some economists argue that deficit spending creates a phenomenon known as crowding out, which makes spending by the government less effective than it otherwise would be, and in fact, in some cases, under some arguments, could actually hurt the economy more than it helps. So to use this, first let's do a quick review on our loanable funds model. First, a reminder that our loanable funds model uses the real interest rate and is primarily interested in discussions of long-term borrowing and lending, and where we can get savers and borrowers connected and how we connect them. So the connectedness market, the supply of loanable funds, is made up primarily of savers in our economy. These are people who are willing to lend by purchasing or demanding assets like bonds, which allow them a vehicle to save their money. The demand for loanable funds then is made up primarily of investment spending. And we say this because this is primarily made up of businesses looking to borrow by issuing these same assets as in the above example. So businesses are going to issue or create assets and sell them to savers, which purchase the assets, and in that way, the savers are moving their money into the hands of investors. And so in this market, as in any market, we find an equilibrium at given rate of interest at which savers are willing to save their money and lenders are willing to, or borrowers are willing to borrow money, and that intersects at QE. And a quick reminder that becomes really valuable when using our loanable funds model is that QE, of course, is where QD and QS intersect, the point at which QD is equal to QS, at which interest rate that is happening. So in this particular model, QD is made up of I and QS is made up of savings, investment spending and savings. So we can say that at this or on this model, the quantity of equilibrium of loanable funds is where savings is equal to investment spending, which is our savings investment spending identity, which is one of the main concepts of circular flow on the financial side of our market, that every dollar saved winds up in the hands of a business who borrows it. So let's come back and begin our discussion on crowding out. Crowding out is overwhelmingly about the concept of deficit spending. And so the first thing we have to think about is, where do deficits come from? Well, deficits come from governments who increase their spending or decrease their tax revenue or increase their transfer payments to the extent that they wind up spending more in government spending and transfer payments than they save or create or bring in revenue in tax revenue. In other words, if we really pull all of this together, expansionary fiscal policies generally rely on the ability of a government to create a deficit. But here's the other side of deficit spending. When governments create deficits, they, in effect, are borrowing money from the public. And now there becomes two ways that we can demonstrate a government taking money from the public in the form of borrowing on our loanable funds model. I'm only going to show you one of these two methods. Both are acceptable for the purposes of an exam. This is the one that I think is more valuable and more worthwhile and more direct in terms of seeing the consequences and the concept of crowding out. If the government borrows money, then people cannot lend money to businesses. In other words, the government is involved in what we call dis-savings. They are reducing the amount of savings that happens in the economy. So when deficits occur, we see a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. So if we move over to our loanable funds model, we can decrease our supply of loanable funds with a shift to the left, and we create a new equilibrium at R2 and Q2. And now we can begin to look at the consequences of crowding out. In the short run, crowding out has potentially very direct consequences. A decrease in, or I'll reverse this really quickly to show the entire process. An increase in deficit spending leads to a decrease in the supply of loanable funds, which leads to an increase in the real interest rate and a decrease in investment spending. And we see the decrease in investment spending when Q on our loanable funds model decreases. This also makes sense because as real interest rates rise, businesses will be less willing to spend their money. The bigger consequence of this, of course, becomes that the decrease in I will lead to a decrease in aggregate demand. So any attempted expansion by the government by increasing government spending or decreasing taxes will in fact be offset by a decrease in investment spending and therefore a decrease in aggregate demand. In other words, the short-term consequence of deficit spending and crowding out is that it makes government policy, fiscal policy in particular, relatively ineffective. And what should be an expansionary policy is less expansionary than we might expect it to be. The long run consequence of this is something we haven't discussed yet in our class, but we will begin to discuss in the coming days. And that is if we follow this same logic, if we increase real interest rates and decrease investment spending, decreases in investment spending will decrease the productivity of our economy over time because most productivity comes from business expenditure on research, development, technology, physical and human capital. So in the long run, we will see a decrease in the growth of our economy caused by a decrease in productivity created by government pressure on interest rates because they are borrowing from the public, which is taking money out of the hands of businesses. And that is maybe the best way that we can summarize this. The theory of crowding out says that government borrowing takes money out of business hands, which is a decrease or leads to a decrease in I.